Welcome to part 77. I'm a video student and I use Blender 2.7. In this tutorial and the next tutorial, we're going to be recreating the title opening sequence of the Netflix show Stranger Things. I am in no way sponsored by Netflix or the show Stranger Things. I just happen to think it's a really great show with a really iconic 1980s looking and feeling opening title sequence. So I wanted to recreate it in Blender, so I'm going to show you exactly how to do that in these next two tutorials. If you've not seen the rest of this entire Blender 2.7 tutorial series, yes, this is number 77, and this whole tutorial series is aimed at teaching beginners and intermediate users of Blender how to use all of the features of Blender to make a short animation. So that's exactly what this is going to be. If you want to see more videos just like this one in Blender and in tech, go ahead and click on that subscribe button below. And hey, if you learned something in this tutorial, go ahead and click on that like button as well. In this intro animation, there is more going on than what meets the eye at first glance. Yes, these are neon looking letters that glow, so we're going to be adding a glowing effect. But if you look closely, there is a couple of variables. The lighting is not even. There are dark patches and light patches, and you might have noticed as we looked at the letters close up that the letters are speckled as well, and yes, they flicker kind of like they're neon lights. In this tutorial, I'm going to be assuming that you know the basics of modeling and texturing and animating in Blender. Again, if you don't know any of those things, you can go ahead and check out my whole tutorial series that this is a part of. But let's go ahead and jump in. I'll click on my splash screen to get rid of it. I already have the screencast keys turned on, so down here in the corner of your screen, you can see what mouse buttons I'm pressing, left and right, as well as what keys I'm pressing on my keyboard. That was the space key. Let's go ahead and jump in. Before we get started though, you're actually going to need to download the font file that they use in Stranger Things in that opening sequence. The font that they use is actually called ICT Bengat. That's how you pronounce that. But I don't have that exact font. I have a very similar font that I found for free. ITC Bengat is actually not a free font. You have to pay for it. I don't want to do that. So on my desktop here, I have the font Bengat Bold. It's very similar. You probably won't notice any differences. But let's go ahead and install that on a Windows computer. I'm going to right click on this, and after you download it, you can right click and copy it. I'm going to go down to Windows Explorer. I'm in my computer now. I'm going to go to my C drive, and right inside of my C drive, I'm going to go to the Windows folder, and I'm going to go to inside the Windows folder, the fonts folder right there. If I go inside that folder, it'll show me all the fonts on my computer. I can right click anywhere in the white area and paste right there. I already had the font installed, so it's asking me if I want to replace it. I'm going to click on no, and so now my font should be installed. You don't have to worry about restarting Blender at all though, because in Blender we don't actually have a font list inside of Blender. We have to actually find the font file. So before we can do that though, I actually have to add a font or piece of text in the 3D viewport on my screen. So I'm going to go ahead and zoom in and press X with that cube selected to get rid of it, and I'll click on delete. I'm going to press Shift A on my keyboard actually. My 3D cursor is all over the place. I'll press Shift S on my keyboard. Shift S brings up the snap menu, and I'm going to select cursor to center. That'll put that 3D cursor in the middle of my screen at 0, 0, 0. I'm going to press Shift A now to bring up my add menu, and of course it adds new objects to where that 3D cursor is. That's why I bother to do that step. I'm going to add a text object. There we go. I'm going to press Tab to go into edit mode of that text, just like any mesh object, except with a text object you can press the backspace key to get rid of the letters. You have a cursor. I'm going to type in all capital letters BORNCG. Don't worry that they're not different sizes. We'll fix that in a few moments. I'll press Tab now to go back into object mode. Now to change the font, to use that Bengat Bold font that I just put in my Windows Fonts folder, I'm going to go over to the Font tab with the font object selected, and I'll go down to the font section, and just under regular I'm going to browse for that font in that same Windows C drive font folder. So C drive, if you don't know where you are, you can always just click over here in the system path, and then you can go to Windows and Fonts, and you have to find it again. It's called Bengat Bold. There it is, and I'll open the font, and as you can see now, we have that font on this text. Now, this is a text object, and it's not going to be very easy to work with it as it is right now, so I'm actually going to convert it to a mesh. Before I do that though, I want to make sure this is as high resolution as I need, because it's actually going to interpret the resolution of this text into edges and vertices and polygons or faces once it's a mesh in Blender. So I'm actually going to go over to this resolution area in the font tab with the font selected, and I'm going to change 12 up to 24 and press enter. So we'll have more, especially where there's curves, we'll have more edges and more resolution. So now I can press Alt-C on my keyboard. Alt-C with the text selected will bring up the Convert To menu. I'm going to select Mesh from Curve Meta Surf Text. So it's going to make it a mesh from one of those things. Great. So now it's a mesh. If I press Tab to go into edit mode, we see all of the edges and vertices and faces, but yuck, this is really disgusting because when you convert a text object to a mesh, you get a bunch of nasty triangles, which we don't want. So I'm going to press A few times on my keyboard to select everything. I'm in edge mode right now, it doesn't really matter. And I'm going to press X on my keyboard. That brings up the delete menu. I'm going to select limited dissolve. If you're not sure what this does, basically it'll take all the faces that are on the same plane and it'll merge them together. So if you have like a very complicated 3D mesh and you select X and limited dissolve, it's going to try to combine or merge together faces that are facing almost the same way. And once we do this, I'll select limited dissolve, we can select the max angle. So try limited dissolve on a high density or high resolution mesh in a different file and you'll see what it does if you don't know. So now I've just used limited dissolve. Before I click anywhere, I'm going to look to see if I'm happy with like the resolution that it just did, because if I change this max angle to be a higher value, it's going to simplify it way too far down. The default was 5. I'm not sure if I'm happy with that. I might actually turn that down to 4 and press enter. So we'll leave it with a higher resolution. If I press tab to go into edit mode and then go into vertice select mode, you can see how many vertices there were left. You can play with that 5, 4 number, or maybe go up to 6 or go down to 3. It's up to you. Great. We have these letters. There are some artifact edges, and that's because you can't have a single face with a hole in it, or 2 holes in this case. So it has to make a few extra faces to make up the B. You can't just have one face with 2 holes in it. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to inset these faces. And before I do that though, I'm going to press tab to go into object mode. I'm going to press, or go down to actually object and apply and rotation and scale. I have maybe scaled these letters in some way, or I just converted them from a text object, so I'm not sure if they're the right scale as far as Blender is concerned. So I'm just going to apply the rotation and scale. You might see me do that a lot, and that's just a good practice or good habit that I have. Okay, let's go back into edit mode. I'm going to press A few times. We're going to select all the faces that way. And I'm going to press I on my keyboard, and I'm going to move my mouse in a little bit, but I'm going to actually right click to undo that. I want you to see what's happening here. I'm going to tap I, and I is for inset faces, and I'm going to move my mouse a little bit in towards the middle of my selection, which is right between the R and the N. It's going to give me a border with a certain thickness. So I'm going to do that again. I. And if I go too far, you're going to notice it overlap in some funny ways, but it really doesn't matter. We can fix that later if we need to. I'm going to make my letters about that thick, right about there, maybe a little bit thicker than that. So right about there. Now I have all these inside faces selected, which is good because I'm going to delete those. Don't worry about this big C or G problem there. We're going to delete the faces that are currently selected. So I'll press X on my keyboard and click on delete faces. There we go. So now what we have left is just the rim, which is what we want. Now, if you're picky and you want to delete or fix, not delete, but fix, I'm going to go and select that face because it's zooming too quickly when I scroll my mouse. I'm going to select that face there and go to view selected. This is what happens when Blender gets confused about how far it should zoom in when you scroll once with your mouse. So if I use view selected, it'll kind of recalculate how much it has to zoom, so now I can zoom more easily. I also have clipping too sensitive, or it's clipping things that are too close to my virtual camera here. So I'm going to turn down clip start to 0.001, basically 0. So now I should be able to go in closer there. This is under the view section of this properties panel on the right side of my 3D viewport. Great. So now if I want to fix this, I can just play around with these vertices. In vertices select mode and edit mode, I can, I pressed H there instead of G. I can move that one to maybe right about there. I can press GG or G twice to slide that vertice down to there. I can GG that one and put it right about there. So now that little overlapping section is corrected. There probably are several more places where that's happening in this mesh. I'm not going to do any more correcting in this video, but right there. So maybe I want to slide with GG that one down to right about there. And GG, maybe that one to right about there. So you can see, you can play around with this. You can maybe slide one of the other ones down. Maybe there was a vertice in there that I should have slid down. Like one that was there, I should slide it down there, but I'm not going to worry about it too much. Great, let's go ahead and start adding materials. So basically there is a more complicated material setup than you might think on this object. So I'm going to divide this larger window into two. I'm going to grab this little triangle area up here and left click and drag it straight down. That's how you divide a window into two in Blender. Of course, you can divide any window you like any number of times that you like, either side by side or up and down like I just did. In fact, I want two windows up here. So I'm going to grab this little triangle area again and left click and drag to the left this time. So left click and drag that way. So now I have three windows where I had just one. I'm going to change this window into a node editor window. This is how we customize materials. And I'm going to make this window down here into a UV image editor window. The reason I do that is because I want to unwrap this Born CG text mesh object that I have, because we're going to be adding an image texture or generated noise and veronoi, I'm not trying to say that, veronoi texture to this text to make it speckled and have sort of a cloud material on it. So I'm going to, with it selected, I'll press tab to go into edit mode. I'll go into face select mode. I'll press A few times to select all of the faces. I'm going to press U, and we're going to say not just unwrap. I haven't marked any seams yet, not smart UV project, but I'm going to say project from view, but I'm going to go right from my top view first. So I'll press 7 on my numpad to go to my top, and then I'll press 5 because I'm in perspective right now to go to top ortho. So 7 and 5, and then I'll make sure everything is selected, and I'll press U, and I'll select project from view, and that basically lays it out in the UV image editor window exactly how you see it. So we're looking at it from an orthographic view. If you're not sure how to do UV mapping, I'll put a link to that tutorial in this video series on the screen right now. In that video, I basically just unwrap and apply an image texture that I draw, I believe, in MS Paint. Even though I hate MS Paint, I apply a texture that I draw in MS Paint to a cube in Blender that I unwrap and apply to. So if you're not sure how to UV map, there's a tutorial right there. I'll put that little eye on the screen. Great, let's go ahead and start using some nodes. So we're going to change our render engine up here. This is very important, from Blender render to cycles render. It's very, very important. And we're going to go to the material tab. I can go back into object mode with a tab key or with that little menu. I'm going to add a new material, and it by default just adds a diffuse shader with a material output, of course. We're not going to use this area to add materials at all. I'm not too worried about this window over here too much, so I'm just going to kind of drag the edge between these two windows over to squash that one down. I can bring it back, make it bigger later if I want to. But at this point, I want to bring in or add a new node to generate a noise texture that we're going to apply to the letters. It's going to define how much of a red glow the letters are emitting. So this is sort of like an image texture, although it's generated right inside of Blender. So let's go ahead and add that now. I'll press Shift A on my keyboard. We're going to bring in a texture, and normally you're probably used to bringing in an image texture from a separate file, but in this case, we're going to use a noise texture right there. It's going to be sort of a cloudy sort of material. But let's go ahead and plug the color into the diffuse color so we can kind of see what it looks like. And we're still in viewport shading solid down here, so I'm going to go to material. So hopefully you can see this on YouTube. We now have sort of a rainbow effect, but what this really is basically a colorful cloud, which is nice. I don't want a colorful cloud though, I want a black and white cloud. So I'm going to press Shift A on my keyboard up here again in my node editor window, and I'm going to add a converter, and we're going to convert the color noise texture to a black and white. So we're going to select RGB, red, green, blue, to black and white, and I'll put that node right about there. So in the middle of that noodle now, it converts the color cloud into a black and white or grayscale cloud. Great. It's very not contrasty though right now. So I'm going to add a brightness and contrast node. So I'll press Shift A on my keyboard. I'm going to add a color bright contrast node. I'll put it right there in the middle of that noodle. And now I can crank up the contrast and you can kind of see what's happening now. I'm getting splotchiness. I might turn down the brightness just a little bit. Maybe I'll turn down the contrast so we don't get quite so much blacks in there. Maybe the brightness, I'll turn that up a little bit just so we have a little bit of unevenness there. We can also change the scale of that noise texture. So right now it's up to 5. I'm going to turn that down to maybe 3. And maybe I'll mute this brightness and contrast so I can kind of see what's going on. Maybe if I mute that one as well, we can kind of see how the scale is working. If I turn this up, you can see the scale is now higher. We get much more quickly changing colors, which is sort of what I want, but maybe I'll use something like 6. That looks pretty good to me. I'm going to unmute with the M key, the RGB to black and white. Maybe I'll unmute this one now. So now we have a black and white cloudy. I might turn the contrast up a little bit, not too much. And so great. We now have a sort of uneven tone material on our letters. That's great. I want to make sure though that this material is using the UV map that we just created. Just a few moments ago, if I went back into edit mode with a tab key, we made this UV map, and basically when you use a noise texture node, it's basically making a square like this that has a cloud material all over it, or noise material. It used to be called clouds, now it's called noise. They're almost the same exact thing, except noise is now used in the Cycles render engine, whereas clouds were used in the old render engine. Anyways, I want to make sure that this noise texture is using the UV map that we just created. So I'm going to go over here, press Shift A on my keyboard. I'm going to input a UV map. I'm going to put that right there. I'm going to connect it up, and we only have one UV map on this mesh, so I'll just click there and select it. Great, nothing changed. Perfect. But right now we just have a black and white kind of a cloudy material on these letters, and we want to glow red using this black and white or grayscale value as the intensity of that red glowing emission, just so that these letters are not evenly lit. We want to make it look as less CG or as not CG as we possibly can. So I'm actually not going to use a regular diffuse shader. So I'm going to press Control X on my keyboard with that node selected, and Control X will get rid of that node. If the inputs and outputs are compatible, in this case this one's yellow and this one's green, so they're not compatible, it'll leave the noodle intact, but in this case it did not. I'm going to press Shift A. I'm going to add a shader. It's going to be an emission shader. That's of course how you get things to have light in the Blender cycle. So I'm going to connect these up, yellow to yellow and green to green. And oh, I actually just realized that I do not want the color from this noise texture to be the color of the emission color, so I'm going to actually move this down, and that's okay, even though we're connecting a yellow to a gray. Basically this means a color image to a black and white image. But because we already use this node, it's already grayscale anyway, so we're not going to mind. I'm going to change the emission color from white to a nice red color. And we have this strength, and if I press Shift Z on my keyboard, that'll switch my viewport shading down here with Shift Z to viewport shading rendered. You can see that our red is not even, and that's what we were going for with the noise texture there, but it's not glowing nearly intensely enough. I'm going to change the background of my world to black just to sort of see what's going on there, but yeah, it's not nearly bright enough. So I'm going to actually add a math multiply node right there. I'll press Shift A on my keyboard. We're going to add a converter math node right there, and by default the math node is set to add. We're going to change it to multiply, and I'm going to change this value to, let's say, 3. And as you can see now, it's a lot brighter. It's not very even. I can play with the scale at this point. Maybe I think that's too big of a scale, so I'll change that maybe to maybe 3 or so. And maybe change the brightness or contrast at this point to kind of see what happens. Maybe scale 3 is too big. Maybe I'll try 10. You can play with the value settings that you like to get the appropriate cloudiness and unevenness that you want. I don't think it's a very good brightness right there because I have some really dark areas. So I'm going to play around with that a little bit. Alright, I just actually paused the video and I changed a few of my settings. I played around with the brightness and contrast. One thing I noticed that made a difference is I changed the detail amount in my noise texture, and that gave me a bit more control over having really dark areas too quickly. If I turn this up, I get some nicer kind of less dark areas, but still darker all over my material. So there we go. It's at this point that I want to add the speckles on these letters, because if I zoom in, you can see that they're very, very plain and even. To do that, I'm actually going to do a little bit of a shortcut here. I'm going to press A on my keyboard in this window to deselect all of these nodes. I'm going to press B to box select, and that brings up these lines through my mouse cursor. I'm going to go to left click and drag through almost all of the nodes, including emission, so they're all selected now. And I'm going to press Shift D on my keyboard. Shift D will duplicate selected objects, even in the 3D viewport. I'm going to put these nodes right down there. We're going to just concentrate on these ones for now, so I'm going to left click and drag that and disconnect that noodle there. I'm going to connect these ones up. It's with these bottom row of nodes that I want to add the speckliness, and to do that I'm actually not going to use this noise texture, so I'm going to press X with that selected. Instead, I'm going to press Shift A. We're going to add a very similar generated texture. We're going to add a veronoi, or veronoi, I'm not sure how to say it, texture, and if I plug that into there and that into there, we can kind of see what we're going to get. In fact, what I might do is select that emission node, and I'm going to delete it. I'm going to press Shift A on my keyboard. I'm just going to add a diffuse shader right there, just so we can kind of see what it looks like with an image without anything funny going on. So to that. And as you can see, it looks a lot like a big version of the noise texture. The scale is not nearly high enough. We want it to be very, very spotty. It's not using any of these nodes yet, by the way, but we will. Maybe I'll get rid of that multiply node though, but we are going to use brightness and contrast and RGB to black and white. Great. The scale we want is going to be really, really huge. It's going to be about 2,000 or 3,000 or so. So now if I zoom in, you can see we get a spottiness, maybe even higher than that. Yeah, I'm actually going to make it 10,000. We want a lot of really little dots. But right now we have a white background or a lighter background with black dots. I want to invert that. So in the node editor window, I'm going to press Shift A on my keyboard. I'm going to bring in a color and invert node, and yeah, that's exactly what it sounds like. It's going to invert those colors. So now we have white dots on a black background, but the ratio is not really correct there. We have really kind of blobs that are all mushing together. So I'm going to disconnect that and bring in my brightness and contrast node there. And now I can play around with these values and get, if I turn down the brightness and up the contrast and play with those values, I can get that nice spottiness that I want. Let's just take a sec and play with that. That looks pretty good to me. Alright, so I just paused the video there to play with these two values. I got a result that I'm happy with. I'm actually not going to use this color to black and white node, so with it selected, I'll press X on my keyboard just to get rid of that. What I'm going to do now is actually not use this diffuse shader. We're not going to have just a black and white image on the letter, so I'm going to get rid of that. I'll select it and I'll press X on my keyboard. Instead, we're going to use that kind of star, spotty, speckly material that we have set up here, and we're going to put it in a glossy shader. We're going to use it as the kind of intensity of the glossiness on our letters. So I'm going to press Shift A on my keyboard. I'm going to add a glossy shader right there, glossy BSDF. I'll put it right there. I'm going to plug the brightness and contrast into the color of that glossy shader. And it's now at this point, yep, we're going to use the mix shader to combine this red emission with this glossy material right there. So I'll press Shift A on my keyboard. I'm going to add in a shader, mix shader. It's a very commonly used shader in Blender cycles. I'm going to connect these up. So I'll plug that one into there, that one into there, and that one into the surface of the material output. And as you can see now, we have a spotty, speckly, uneven set of letters. Let's go ahead and do a quick save. I'll press Control S on my keyboard, and on my desktop I'll just call this Stranger Things intro-077-001, sure, and save Blender file. Alright, so we have the materials mostly set up for our letters. I actually think that these are not bright enough in terms of the amount of emission glow, so I'm going to turn this multiply value up. That's going to control the strength of that emission from 2 up to 5. Yeah, it's quite a bit brighter, but I think it's appropriate considering that these are neon lights, so we'll use a value of 5 for the most part. Let's go ahead now and set up the positioning of our letters as they're going to appear at the very end of this intro animation. So I don't need this node editor window anymore. I'm just going to actually squash it a little bit. I'll drag the edge of that window up so we get more of our 3D viewport. I'll press Shift Z on my keyboard. Shift Z will bring me back into the previous viewport shading, which in this case is material viewport shading. Now these letters are too wide. They're actually squashed side to side or horizontally in the actual Stranger Things title sequence. So I'll tap S and then X on my keyboard. If you tap S and then X, you can of course scale only on that X axis, and I'll make, that's how they are by default, so S and then X. I'll make them just a bit narrower. Now I actually want to separate out all of these letters into separate objects, so I'm going to press Tab to go into edit mode. I'm in face select mode right now. I'll press A to make sure nothing is selected. Then if I put my mouse over one of these letters, in this case I'm going to select the O, so I'll put my mouse over the part of the O there and press L. L will select all the linked faces or vertices or edges that your mouse is over, so all the linked ones to where your mouse is over. We want to select this one as well, so I'll press L as well, and then I'll press P on my keyboard. P will bring up the separate selection. I'll select separate selection, and now that O is a separate object. If I go back into object mode, you can see now, again, all the word except for that O is its own object, but then this O is its own object. Great, let's go back to the main word. I'll press Tab to go back into object mode, or edit mode rather, and I'll press A few times just to make sure nothing is selected. L, and then P and selection, L and P and separate selection, L and then P to separate selection, and then L right there. You have to make sure your mouse is actually over it, and then P and separate selection. So now I'm still in edit mode of just the B. I'll press Tab to go back into object mode. We have separate objects, which is great, but their origin is all where the original origin was of the entire word. That means that C's origin, where the gizmo is over there, which is what we do not want. So I'm going to press A and then B to box select. We're going to box select all the letters. Actually, I'll just do this. I'll hold Shift and right click to get them all. Are they all selected? Yes, they are. And I'm going to go over here to my Tools tab in the Tool shelf, and I'm going to click on Set Origin to Center of Mass. And what that will do is it'll move the origin points of all the selected objects to their own centers, basically. That's a decent enough explanation. So now their gizmos and their little orange origin dots appear in the middle of themselves and not in some other weird place. That's perfect. We want the B and the C and the G to be a little bit bigger, so I'm going to select all three of those just so they're all the same size, and I'll tap S to scale those up, and I'll move those down. Let's go ahead and squash these together a little bit, so I'm going to leave that R actually. I'm going to press B and box select. We're going to put the middle of the word right in the middle of our scene. Yeah, why not? Let's go ahead and move that N and that R a little bit closer to the middle there. We might want these to be touching in the end. I'll move that C over. Somebody actually noted when I posted this video a few days ago, my finished version on my Facebook page, and on my channel, I forget where the comment was, but that in the actual opening sequence of Stranger Things, they actually have the G cut off. So if you want to go into edit mode, if you want to go into edit mode of the G and press Tab, and then I'll actually just go back into solid view. What I can do here is go into vertice select mode in edit mode of that G. And if I take all of these, I'll press C actually on my keyboard. C goes into circle select mode, so now I can just select all these vertices to right about, I'm thinking of a straight line. Actually, I'll middle mouse click right there to deselect those. I'll press Enter to exit circle select mode, and I'll press X on my keyboard, and I'm going to dissolve these vertices. So now I'll have a straight edge, and now I can just kind of move these around a little bit, and so that they're going in a straight up and down line approximately. I'll grab that one and that one, and I'll move them so they're this is going to match the thickness of that, and then I'll scale them up and down with the S key a little bit just so we get an even thickness all the way around, sort of about like that. Sure, I'm sort of happy with that. I actually, after I scaled the C and the G and the B, I might want to apply the scale of these objects, so I'm going to just do them one at a time. Object, apply, rotation and scale, object, apply, rotation and scale, and object, apply, rotation and scale. And that's just so that the noise texture isn't stretched, or the clouds texture, or whatever they're called, the veronoi texture is not stretched on these objects, and it's on a different scale than on the smaller letters. So let's go ahead and position these up. That one there, that one there. And the reason we're putting these all in the right spot now is so that we can actually animate them coming together in reverse. So they're going to start off together, and then they're going to go in their own direction, and then we'll just reverse the animation in the dope sheet editor window. And that's easy to do. Great. We want the those bars to appear, and if you watch the intro closely, you'll notice that they actually expand from the middle. It's actually not very hard to do. What I'll do is I'm going to put my 3D cursor right about there. I'm going to press Shift A on my keyboard. I'm going to add just a plane, and we're looking at our scene from our top orthographic view. That's important because we're seeing this straight on. I'm going to tap S to scale this down. It's right about there. I'll tap S and then Y, and because that's the Y green direction, if I tap S and then Y, we can make that shorter or narrower now. I'll tap S and then X to scale that out to, actually it doesn't matter because we're going to animate it anyways. And I'm going to inset this, so I'll tap, actually before I inset, you always have to go to Object and Apply and Rotation and Scale, because now if I want to press Tab to go into edit mode, and I tap I to inset, and I try to copy that same thickness roughly, now I can make sure that these walls are even. If you do not go down to Object in Object mode and Apply and Rotation and Scale, and you inset, your walls will not be the even thickness that you want. So that's why you do that when you're about to inset. I'll tap X to delete that inside face, and I'll get rid of that face there. Great. To make this bar grow from nothing, we're actually going to add an armature, and we're going to have two bones in this armature that are going to control these four vertices and these four vertices. We're going to have two bones, and we're just going to animate the bones moving out. And because there's no vertices or edges kind of going up and down in the middle here, we can really easily animate this bar expanding out. So I'm going to select these four vertices. I'm going to press Shift S on my keyboard. We're going to put the 3D cursor to the selected four vertices, so cursor to selected. I'll press Tab to go into object mode. I'll press Shift A on my keyboard. Shift A brings up the add menu. I'm going to add an armature single bone, and I don't care what direction it's going really. Let's go back to the top view with the 7 key, and I'll press Tab to go into edit mode. Actually, yeah, let's go into edit mode, and I'm going to move that straight down because we don't need the bone to be that big. And I'm just going to duplicate that bone. But before I do that, I'm going to go back into object mode, go back into edit mode of the bar. I'm going to select those four vertices with the Shift key, Shift S, cursor to selected, and then press Tab, and then go back into edit mode of that bone. And actually, because I'm in edit mode and my 3D cursor is right there, if I press Shift A on my keyboard, it's going to add a same bone or a bone to this armature in that exact location. So now I can go to my front view, and I'll just try to sort of copy the size of that bone. I shouldn't have scaled that one down earlier, so I could scale them both down at the same time, but it's too late for that. Great. So now I have two bones in the same armature, and if I go into pose mode now, this is where I can actually animate these bones. Before we do that though, I actually want to connect this mesh so that the vertices in that mesh are controlled by the bones. So I'm going to select the mesh, I'm going to hold Shift, I'm going to select one of the bones. We're still in pose mode now. I'm going to hold Shift, select one of the bones, doesn't matter which one, and I'll press Control P. Control P brings up Set Parent To, and I'm going to select Armature to Form, but click on With Automatic Weight. So I'm going to click right there. And so now hopefully the right four vertices, or the correct four vertices, got associated to the right bone. So now if I move that bone, it stretches that bar. Let's check this one. Perfection. So now if I go to my top view, I can put that bone right there, that bone right there. Let's select the entire object in object mode of the armature. I'll hold shift and select that mesh, and now I'll press shift D because we're going to duplicate this for the top. I'm going to have a bar across the top and right there as well. So shift D, I'm going to move that to right about there, sure. And in pose mode, I'm going to move that one to right about there, and that one to right about there. Even though I think these bars start in their squashed position, we're going to just set it up right now so we can see how it's all going to look in the end. I think actually that this bar needs to go a bit farther down, closer to the letters, so I'm going to go back into object mode and just move that down a little bit like that. Sure, I'm happy with that mostly. I'll just move this one over a little bit. Okay, let's go ahead and see how this is going to look. I'm going to press Shift Z on my keyboard to go into viewport shading render. We don't have this red glowing material on the bars there, so I'm going to select each one. In fact, I'll go into viewport shading material, and I'm just going to add the same material, which is just called material.001, to both of these. We have to actually unwrap these things as well, so we'll do that in just a sec. I'm going to add that one like there and that one there. If I go into viewport shading render with Shift Z on my keyboard, you can see that they're kind of getting the right material, but the speckliness and the unevenness are not working because we have to unwrap. So I'm going to select this one. I'll press Tab again to go into edit mode. I'm going to select all the vertices in this case, or faces, and then I'll tap U, and I'll say project from view again. And now we have a UV map on that bar. Let's go ahead and go back into object mode, and we'll select this bar, tab to go into edit mode. I'll press A few times to select all the faces. I'll tap U on my keyboard, and we're going to select project from view. So now we have a UV map for 3 things. In fact, all the separate letters. Doesn't really matter. We have the speckliness all over everything. Our material still has these UV map nodes, which are referring to the UV map of the original whole word, but I believe, I'm not actually sure about this, that the UV map default name for anything is just UV map, and because we have separate objects, the UV maps on the separate objects can just be called the same thing. So we're not running into any kind of name conflicts there, which is really, really handy. So we kind of got off scot-free there. Let's go and see how that looks. I'm really, really liking that. The only downside here is that because we're stretching these bars, the speckliness might get stretched as well, although we don't actually see these bars until the very end, so I'm not too concerned. Let's go and do a quick save. Control S and click. At this point, I want to add the glowing effect, and that's actually done in post-processing. That's a compositing effect that you do after you render, and basically Blender looks at the bright areas in your render. In this case, it's very contrasty. We have a bright glowing set of letters, and we have a black background. It's going to find the bright areas, and it's going to make those glow in that same color. The way you do that is up here in the node editor window. Right now, we're using only material nodes. That's that button right there, but right next to it are the compositing nodes. I actually wasn't sure if this video was going to belong in my video effects series in Blender. If you have not seen that series, in which I talk about how to add visual effects to movies in Blender, including things like adding a split screen effect to make yourself duplicated on the screen at the same time, doing a video stabilization and corner pinning, and doing wire removal to make it look like you're making things levitate, and the Harry Potter Lumos wand effect, things like that. I wasn't sure if this belonged in that series, but I figure this is mostly animation and there's no actual video involved, so I added this to this normal Blender tutorial series instead of that VFX series. So let's go ahead and continue though. We're actually going to click on Use Nodes now. We've changed our node editor window mode over to the compositing nodes. We're going to click on Use Nodes, and basically what we're getting here now are 2 nodes. This is called the Render Layers node, and that is actually what's going to bring into our nodes what we render out from our 3D scene. The composite is sort of the output that you're actually rendering out to. You need this this composite node to actually render anything out, but in the middle of this noodle is where we can actually add effects. So I'm going to press Shift A on my keyboard, and I'm going to add a filter, we're going to add a glare filter. So I'm going to add that in right there. Now, when you first add it in, it actually does not do anything, and that's because this threshold value is turned up to 1. We're going to turn that down to 0 and press enter. And what we actually have to do before we'll see anything is do a real render of our scene. So I'm actually going to mute this glare node with the M key. I can mute it. You can see that now it's red. It's not taking any effect. I'm going to do a proper render. So under the camera tab, I'm going to change my rendering device. If you have an NVIDIA-based graphics card on your computer, you should be able to render with your video card. I will do that to save time. I'll change my resolution up to 100% of 1080p. I'll click on render, and over here we're seeing what things look like. Ooh, the camera is not in the right spot. Let's press Shift-Z down here, and let's find that camera. There it is. I'll press Alt-R. Alt-R will clear its rotation. By default, it's rotated at some funny diagonal angle, but Alt-R will point it straight down. I'll go to my top view, orthographic top view, put it right there. I'll press 0 on my numpad to look through it, and I just happen to be at the right zoom level approximately. Let's go ahead and do another render. Alright, so it did a quick render. It actually took longer than it should have with my GPU enabled, and that's because if you're using a graphics card, again an NVIDIA-based graphics card, you want to make sure that your tiles, your rendering tiles, those squares that render out in your scene are set under performance to a larger number. If you're rendering with your CPU, and this is set to CPU, you want a smaller size of tile. So if you're using a CPU, I would use 16 and 16. When you're using a GPU like I am, I would use 512 by 512 or something high up like that, maybe 256 by 256, but I'm going to use 512 by 512. And you can see we have our render as it should look, but now I'm going to unmute this glare node. I'll press M, and again, because I turned the threshold down to 0, we now get this nice glowing effect. This is the star effect, or streaks rather. We've got different versions here. If I add it or change it to simple star, we get sort of a more simple low-res version. Of course, we can change the quality up to high. What I want is actually fog glow, and this is a more subtle effect. You can hopefully see what that's doing there. It's making a very subtle glow. I can change the size maybe up to 9. That's about as high as it goes. You can change or play around with these values as much as you like. That's a pretty good effect there. I might actually use it twice, so I'll just press Shift-D on my keyboard, put it there. You can see what the effect is going to be. You can see the progress of the compositing up here. It can be quite slow, and that's a lot of glow right there. But that's quite nice. Maybe I'll change the size of this one down to 4 or so I get a small glow and then a larger glow. What I could do actually is add the same streaks again, but change the number of streaks up to 16, which I believe is the highest, and streaks tend to be quite nice. And then maybe I'll change the fade value to make the streaks a different size. We'll just see how this turns out. Oh, that's way too bright. To affect the performance, you'll notice that compositing is quite slow in Blender. I recently found out that if you're using a GPU, you can actually, as your render device, you can actually change the performance, I believe, of compositing over here in the side panel. It's the N key side panel of your compositing nodes window. You can use OpenCL, and that will apparently increase using a chunk size of a higher value like 512 by 512. That'll increase the speed of your compositing to add these effects, so you won't have to wait so long, by a little bit at least, over many frames as you're rendering out this animation. So that's way too much. I'm going to play with this fade value. I may turn this up a little bit and see how that does. No, that's not what I want. I'm going to turn the fade down to maybe something like 0.2. Alright, so I've played around with the values in my second glare node, and I changed my mix down to negative 0.6, and that just helped me turn down the amount of streak glowiness. I didn't want this node to have as much effect as it did by default, so you can pause the video and see what settings I'm using and copy those, or just play around with them for yourself. You'll notice that there's some unevenness in the tone besides just the variableness from our noise texture. texture, there's a lighter area over here, and that's actually because of the lamp in my scene. Again, if you look back at the material nodes on any of the letter or bar objects, you'll know that there's a glossy material and it's getting its color from that veronoi texture, and that is actually white and black. So we actually have some white that's mixed together with the red emission shader. So yes, you will have some white in there. I'm actually going to go out of my camera view down here in my 3D viewport, and we're not going to change the color of the material. Instead, we're going to adjust the lamp color. So I'm going to go over with the lamp selected to the lamp tab in the properties window, and I'm actually going to make this into an area lamp. I'm going to make it 5 by 5. I'm going to get rid of the rotation on it because it's pointed at sort of a diagonal angle. So Alt-R to clear its rotation. I'll click on Use Nodes, and I'm going to actually go at this point, I'm going to divide this larger window into 2 so I can have I'll press T and N and T and N so I can have one viewport shading rendered. So I'll go through my camera over here with the 0 key on my numpad, and I'll press Shift Z, and I can scroll up. You can see now that as I move this light around, you can see that I get a different amount of glossiness. I don't want this light to be white though. I'm going to have it actually emit kind of an orangey color. Don't go all the way, of course, because then you won't get any highlights, but this will just help it be not quite so uneven or have whitiness to it. I don't think this is too big, maybe 3 and 3. There we go. So now we get a bit more orangey there. Great. So now hopefully when we zoom in, I'm actually going to change this 3D viewport to have viewport or have the viewport lock the camera to the view, so I can actually move the camera now. You can see it kind of moving up and down there as I scroll in. If I scroll in a lot and I'm going to select a letter and I can't zoom any further, it's kind of stuck. So I'll go to View and View selected, and I have a letter selected there. So View and View selected, so now I can zoom in and you can see that nice spotty material, and you can see some variance as you kind of go across the letters. You'll see different brightnesses because of where that lamp is. You might get less sheen on the B as opposed to the C or the N with letters in that spot. So now let's do a quick render out and we'll see how it looks. And of course when it renders, you won't see the glare until after it processes out those compositing nodes. And there we go. So we have some letters. I might want to adjust the materials at this point. Maybe it's too bright there, the white. We can play around with the amount of material nodes, the factor here. Maybe I want to be more red and not quite be so speckly. That's really up to you. Let's do a quick render. In fact, while we're talking about rendering, because this is a very low res scene, because we're not doing any kind of fancy shading, at least not in terms of like balanced lighting, I can turn down my samples. Right now it's sampling at 128. Ouch, let's just do 32 and let's see how that looks. We can save ourselves a lot of render time just by changing that value. And actually, because we're rendering out something that we want to look noisy, that actually might help, but I'm going to click on this little clock too. That means that we'll get a different pattern of little speckly noise in every time or in every frame of our render. So make sure you check that little clock and change your render samples down to something lower. Great, we got a nice effect. I might turn this down actually a little bit more even and do another render. Let's see how that looks. Maybe that's not quite speckly enough, so maybe 0.25, and I'll render again. That's looking pretty darn good to me. The last thing we'll do in terms of the material is, this is a neon light from the 1980s. It needs to flicker, and that's one of the kind of flaws. You want lots of flaws in this video because this is supposed to look old. Actually, before we add the flicker animation, I want to add one more thing in my compositing nodes, which is called lens distortion. I'm going to press Shift A on my keyboard. We're going to go to distort. Again, we're in the compositing nodes, not material nodes right there. So Shift A on my keyboard. We're going to add distort and lens distortion, and there's a few ways you can use this, but I'm going to put this right there in the middle of that noodle. We're going to use projector distortion, and once you do that, it kind of grays out, jitter, and fit. And I'm going to turn dispersion up to maybe 0.8 or so. And what that does is it basically simulates a old TV or projector that would have red, green, and blue filters that are not aligned properly. This could be part of the old animation process of doing a title like this in the 1970s or 1980s. They had to kind of photograph an animation like this manually using clear pieces of plastic that are cut out with masks and stuff like that, and take pictures. And it was a crazy process, but you would get sometimes things that weren't aligned properly. That's what that simulates. So if I zoom in on that, you can kind of see that we're getting some color separation there, which is kind of what we want. And 0.8 seems to do a nice value. I think 1 is too high, but you can play around with that on your own. Let's go and do some flickering of our lights. And luckily this is very, very easy. Over in our material nodes with a letter or bar selected, we have this multiply value, which is set to 5 right now. I turned this up to 5 because I'm going to animate it going up and down. To do animation, I'm going to make my timeline a little bit taller. I'm going to divide it into 2. And I'm going to change this top window into a dope sheet window. That's for more advanced control of your animation. We're going to set a bunch of keyframes of this value. So at frame 1, which is where we are right now, I'm going to put my mouse over this little box and tap I on my keyboard. I means insert keyframe. And because it's going to this material is on lots of objects, all the letters and the bars, we're getting a bunch of keyframes on all the different objects. But don't worry about it. We're changing it once. We're going to animate it once, and it's going to apply to all the objects exactly the same, which is great. We don't have to animate it a bunch of times. Perfect. Okay, so at frame 0, or frame 1 rather, it's at 5 brightness. Let's go ahead and go a little bit later. We're animating at 24 frames per second here. I know that because under the camera tab, we're running at 24 FPS right there. I'm going to go back over 5 and I'll tap I. As at this point that I want to animate it going down a little bit. So I'm going to go to the next frame, frame 6, change this value to 2.5, and I'll type I again to insert a keyframe. And now I can just select this dope sheet summary, this keyframe at the very top of this row, and duplicate this set of keyframes. So Shift D on my keyboard will duplicate. I'll slide it over to right about there. And I found I actually tried doing several renders of this animation when I was practicing for this video. And if you have, let's say, a more spaced out flicker, it will not look as good. Okay, so I put them tight together. It's a quick flicker, and you don't want the flicker to go all the way down. If it goes down to 0 and then back up to 5, it's too much. It won't look like a nice flicker. I found that 5 to 2.5 is a really good amount. So now I can just select these 3 keyframes, and I can kind of go crazy with, why is that not selecting? I can go crazy with my duplication. So I'm going to select that one. There we go. There we go. I don't know why it wouldn't select in the dope sheet summary. Great, we've got those 3 selected. Shift D on my keyboard. I'm just going to kind of space these out. Again, we're working at 3 or 24 frames per second. So I'm going to Shift D, maybe put a bigger space there, but closer together there. And I'm just going to kind of go randomly through. And in case you're wondering, the shorter version of the intro that I had at the very beginning of this video was about 460 frames long. So you can imagine a lot of duplicating has to be done here. But once I do a few, I'll just duplicate the whole series and we'll get some nice randomness, but it'll be repeating over a sequence of 120 frames or so. So I'm going to select everything now. I'll press A on my keyboard a few times to select everything. I'll press Shift D on my keyboard. I'll put it right about there. Great. I'll press A a few times again. Shift D. Slide those down to right about, right about there. That first keyframe is a full 5 keyframes, so I was overlapping it with the last set of 3 there. And so now we have 480. That looks pretty good to me. I'm happy with that. Now, because we're about to start animating these letters, I don't want to see these keyframes anymore, so I can add a filter or change what keyframes I'm showing in my dope sheet. And I believe, I'm not sure if they're going to be node, but yeah, they're node keyframes there. I wasn't sure if they were material. Oh, they are material. So I can turn off any keyframes. I don't want to see any keyframes to do with materials. So that's great. Now I don't see those keyframes anymore. Perfect. Well, so at this point, I'm actually going to finish off this tutorial in part 2 of this mini-series on how to create the intro in the style of Stranger Things. We're going to animate, of course, the letters coming from all different directions and forming the title. We're also going to animate the bars expanding out, including I'm going to show you how to actually make it so that you can have objects hidden up until you want them to be visible. We're going to animate the camera movement and the camera switching between different positions. We're going to adjust the lighting and add some more lights to the scene. We're going to be adding music into Blender in case you want to actually render out to a movie file with the music intact. I'm going to show you what music I use for my intro opening. And of course the render settings. So that will be it for this tutorial. Thanks for watching. If you like this video or you learned something, go ahead and click on that like button. And if you want to see more videos just like this one in Blender and in tech, go ahead and click on my subscribe button below. Go and check out my Facebook page at facebook.com/borncg. But that'll be it for this one. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.